Today, we're going to explore how the Disney Studios, working with a branch of the U.S. government, contributed to U.S. foreign policy during the early months of World War II. It's an unusual concept to grasp that back in 1941, Walt Disney and his artists worked to solidify hemispherical unity between North, Central, and South America in conjunction with a federal agency to limit Nazi influence in the region. And of course, this is part of our ongoing story about Disney artist Herb Ryman. We're now up to part 10. Herb Ryman, even though back at this time he was a relatively new hire at the Disney Studio, had been selected to accompany Walt and other key artists to Brazil and Argentina to research their culture in order to make a series of short cartoons that would highlight life in those and other South American countries. When we left off last time, Ryman, along with other artists, had spent days flying from Burbank to Rio de Janeiro, where they waited for Walt along with a few other artists to arrive on a separate plane. As we begin today, the team is all assembled, though in two different hotels, and they are ready to begin their work in Brazil. But before I kick off today's episode, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp supporters, as these are the people who keep all of these efforts going. Gratitude is going out today to Mr. CCB5, Mark, Ken C, Stephanie, Lex Ace, Jay Farmer, and Disney Girl. Thanks to each of you for supporting the work we do here. And now, we're looping back to 1941 to Rio de Janeiro as the European war continues to spread around the world. If you're ready, here we go. Once the group of Disney artists were together in Rio de Janeiro, Ryman believed that they would focus on research, but from the start, social engagements occupied a great deal of their time, events where they were presented as artists from the famous Disney studio. On the first night with Walt in town, the group went to Casino de Urca, a dinner hosted by film distributor RKO. The artists believed that they would mix in with the locals, similar to a nightclub back home. The Casino de Urca, or the Urca Club as some artists called it, had once been home to singer Carmen Miranda. It had been visited by celebrities such as Bing Crosby and Orson Welles. But as Ryman and the others visited, they quickly discovered hundreds of reporters and fans hoping to glimpse Walt Disney. Back home in Los Angeles, Walt might attract the notice of a columnist or a few film buffs. But here in Brazil, he was a celebrity. Even the casino decorated one of its showrooms with images from Fantasia. For Ryman, this night had shades of his experience in England and France, where locals revered Walt as though he were in the movies, not merely a producer of them. Now Ryman saw the same situation play out in Brazil, where Walt was treated as a luminary. Brazilians wanted to meet him because he was the father to Mickey Mouse and Snow White. From this first night, it was clear that the group needed to adjust their expectations for the trip. Walt would draw crowds wherever he went, which would interfere with the work they hoped to complete. In those initial days, the Disney artists were guided toward cosmopolitan centers in Rio rather than sites of Brazilian traditions, as locals had more pride in their modern identity than they did in their past. American dancers performing at a nearby club helped the artist understand the city as locals saw it. Frank Thomas wrote, "Their colorful past, the old buildings, colonial towns, and native styles are of course distinctive, but they don't want us to see that." Instead, locals wanted the artists to see how Rio was changing. Accordingly, Ryman and others adjusted their ideas as to how films might be arranged to showcase Brazil. Some key concepts, such as how cartoons might focus on classical music and the myths of South America, were quickly modified. Instead, Walt became interested in adding popular music into his cartoons, specifically a modern samba. Likewise, artists focused on contemporary characters and situations that might be presented with animation. Ryman enjoyed being in South America and saw it as an opportunity to explore traditions of art in other countries. "I wanted to learn about Argentine art, which is based on Europe," he said. In particular, he was looking forward to meeting a painter who he called the great artist Molina Campos, who had been born and lived in Argentina. Over the past decade, perhaps more than any other South American artist, Campos had developed a reputation in the United States mainly as a painter who documented the traditional life of the gaucho cowboys. Campos was even scheduled to have a solo exhibition at the Modern Art Museum in San Francisco, a rarity for an artist from any South American country. But the meeting between Walt and Campos was scheduled for later in the trip, after the group had spent a week and a half in Brazil. In terms of studio work, the overall goal for the Disney team was to develop or acquire material that could be used to create cartoon shorts that presented the local culture with authenticity and respect. Chuck Wolcott oversaw music selections, including music rights. Frank Thomas, assisted by others, focused on developing characters that spoke to South American themes, both animal characters and human characters whose identities reflected the traditions of individual countries. In practice, the Disney artist followed familiar research strategies that had begun with Bambi, a film that was set in the woods of Maine. As most Disney artists had never visited Maine, Disney acquired photos, 16mm footage, and artistic representations to guide production. Now Ryman and the others did the same in South America. "I was assigned the task of making notes and studies for the backgrounds," Ryman said. "The jungle, the pampas, the skies, the trees, the flora and fauna of these regions." The artists moved in groups. At times, their jobs overlapped. Though Frank Thomas was the only animator in the group, other artists explored how characters might be developed. Based on the popularity of parrots, Disney artists believed that a parrot character would be the ideal animal if well designed to present the culture of Brazil. When visiting a local zoo, Ryman was among those who sketched out a cartoon parrot, a creature who over time evolved into the urbane animated character Jose or Joe Carioca, a parrot with a straw hat who was an expert tour guide and master of the samba. As the Disney team was split between two hotels, the artists simply gathered as they could. Eventually, the lobby of the Hotel Gloria became the de facto meeting place for most artists, where they discussed what they had experienced that day and how it might be arranged into films. The one topic that they tended to avoid was speculation on the strike that they assumed was still unfolding back home. In a letter to his wife, Ted Sears wrote, "No use wasting paper to talk over the studio shutdown. No one here knows any of the details, but all are hoping for the best." Despite endless receptions and fine dinners, Ryman and the rest understood that beneath their research was a serious goal: to combat elements of Nazi influence that they occasionally glimpsed around them. The systems of government in Brazil and Argentina were really not compatible with our State Department, Ryman explained, and the Axis powers, meaning Italy and Germany, had made great inroads into South America. Their work here in demonstrating that America, through the creation of Disney cartoons, both understood and respected South American culture, was designed to counteract attempts by Germany and Italy to align Brazil, Argentina, and other countries with Nazi interests. Their efforts to influence the people of Brazil would be better received, the artists knew, if their visit was framed as a research trip rather than as a diplomatic mission coordinated through the CIA. In a letter, Frank Thomas wrote, "Accordingly, we are cautioned increasingly to keep still about the $500,000 the government is sinking into this venture." Initially, Ryman had two jobs: to capture the scenery and the mood of Brazil with art and to film it with one of 3 studio-owned 16mm cameras. Ryman was a natural pick for camera work as he had the most experience with live-action production. But once in Brazil, Walt asked that Ryman focus on drawing and painting with others handling the cameras to document the trip. Filming would be instead handled by Larry Landsberg and Lee Blair. Walt himself would also take some footage. But the request that Ryman focus on his drawings and paintings was a clear sign, again, that indicated how much Walt valued Ryman's artistic ability, placing it even over the ability of others who were on the trip. Soon Ryman was grouped with two other artists, the husband and wife team Lee and Mary Blair, who were also charged with making atmospheric sketches and paintings that would later guide film production. Together they visited the botanical gardens, the beach, and other areas around the city. They focused on scenic paintings that might later be adapted for backgrounds. They also focused on capturing the nuances of Brazilian architecture, as well as the clothes worn by locals. We took photographs and made sketches, Ryman said. But there was another story that was slowly unfolding in South America. Ryman was finally spending long hours with Walt and Lillian, as well as with Bill Cottrell and his wife and Walt's sister-in-law, Hazel. This was a great experience, Ryman explained, not only being close to Walt Disney, but we were learning something about developing films. For Walt, the trip to South America was different than for his artists. Though he had requested that the CIAA minimize his role as a goodwill ambassador, he repeatedly met with the press and dignitaries. Dictators were in power, Ryman explained. The State Department knew that sending senators and congressmen down to South America would get nowhere, because all they did was increase the friction between the countries. Well, here was a man, Walt Disney, that could be sent anywhere in the world and people would love him. On the night of August 23rd, President Getúlio Vargas invited Walt and the Disney artist to attend the Brazilian premiere of Fantasia. Arranged as a benefit for a children's charity, the event was held at the Cinema Pathé, only a mile from the hotel where most of the artists stayed. Once more, Walt was not only a celebrity, he was a type of political dignitary, representing the most personable and ethical aspects of American culture. For foreigners, he was a diplomat for America's highest ideals, a person who represented a vision for what the United States might be under ideal conditions. Repeatedly, Walt expressed his desire to focus on gathering materials for his films. I visited with the ambassador, Walt explained, but told him, I'm here on a mission of actually trying to get the material. But repeatedly, he was cajoled into additional appearances where always he appeared to enjoy himself as locals expressed their gratitude for the films he had created. The initial plan was for the Disney artists to stay in Rio for 10 days, but as Ryman and others felt more time was necessary, their stay was extended to 3 weeks. During these additional days, Ryman traveled outside Rio to work on landscape sketches. He took photos of downtown streets that he believed would later prove helpful. With other artists, he attended nights of dancing, attempting to capture the energy of the samba in quick sketches. One of his drawings presented a crowd in which each person appeared mesmerized by the music. Larry Landsberg filmed these same dancers, footage that could later be broken down into a series of reference stills to guide animators in their drawings. Night after night, they stayed out until the wee hours of the morning, attempting to take it all in. Brazilian music and dancing is really a virus that hits you badly, Janet Martin explained. You go to bed with the exciting rhythms of the samba pounding through your veins, and when you're standing around somewhere, you find yourself going into little knee-bending swingy samba steps, all by yourself. But you don't feel foolish because everybody else in Brazil does the same thing. The delayed departure from Rio gave them more time to understand the richness of Brazilian culture, but it also created an unexpected problem. Initially, the Disney team planned to meet the artist Molina Campos in Buenos Aires. Walt believed that Campos's paintings of gauchos might guide the studio toward the creation of at least one short, if not a series of shorts. As folk heroes, gauchos were commemorated in epic poems and stories like cowboys in America. With bolas, they worked with cattle and occasionally hunted birds and small animals for food. In the world of fine art, Campos was the chronicler of the gauchos. But Campos would be in New York by the time Disney artists now arrived in Buenos Aires. Instead, he agreed to stop briefly in Rio on his way north. On the afternoon of September 3rd, Campos arrived at Walt's hotel carrying boxes of drawings with others arranged into a portfolio book. Sitting on the floor of the hotel room, cigar in his mouth, he showed his work to Walt and a few Disney artists, including Ryman. Campos came to Rio de Janeiro to meet Walt, Ryman explained, and I also met him there. They looked at drawings that presented the landscape of Argentina. They admired paintings of gauchos who worked the plains just outside of Buenos Aires. When they were finished, with an understanding that the studio would later continue its relationship with Campos, they went out for food. Even though Campos was one of, if not the most famous living artist in South America, Ryman again noticed that it was Walt, not Campos, who commanded the public's attention. Walt himself was treated like a god, Ryman observed. Except for John Rose, who again traveled ahead to set up the next leg of the trip, following Campos's visit, Ryman and the rest of the Disney artists stayed in Rio for another 5 days, where they painted, recorded music, and discussed possibilities for the Goodwill cartoons, with impromptu story meetings led by Ted Sears in the lobby of the Hotel Gloria. In these final days, they also relaxed. They went swimming, they attended farewell parties, where they said goodbye to people they had met over the previous 3 weeks. During their last day, they packed up brushes and pencils, as well as the few clothes they had brought, and prepared for their flight to Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. More so than Brazil, Argentina was central to the American efforts with the Good Neighbor program, as Nazi influence there was stronger than that in other South American countries. Disney artists were warned that some residents might object to their presence as they represented American business culture. Already, a few newspapers tied to Nazi influence had denounced the artists' visit as nothing more than pro-American propaganda. But all of these concerns were set aside as the Disney team arrived, first Walt and Lillian in one plane, and then the others in a plane that followed, to find thousands of well-wishers crowded into the airport. The Argentina portion of the trip unified the Disney artists into the Alvear Palace Hotel, located downtown close to the beaches and a set of parks. For the first time, the artists had rooms on a single floor, which allowed them to feel like a unified traveling group. I had a room near Walt and Lily's room, Ryman recalled. In the top floor ballroom, Disney established a temporary studio. At one time, Disney had viewed Buenos Aires as the location for a branch studio, a field office that might hire local artists to collaborate with the Disney team to deepen the authenticity of these productions. But by this point, plans to set up a permanent studio in Argentina had mostly fallen by the wayside. This was now, for all intents and purposes, a research trip. Still, the team filled the space with studio equipment shipped months earlier to Buenos Aires, which included drafting tables, animation desks, and corkboards to post story drawings. They had even sent a moviola, a small projector animators used to review test footage. It arrived in a big wooden crate delivered by 2 large Argentinians, who were concerned that it might be a weapon. Frank Thomas was unable to explain what a moviola was in a way that satisfied them. Over a few hours, he reassembled the machine following directions tucked into the crate. These guys just stood there looking at me, he recalled. One thing I hadn't considered was that Buenos Aires had 220-volt outlets instead of 110. Once the machine was reassembled, he inserted a reel of film, turned on the switch, only to watch as smoke rose up from the motor. But the botched demonstration was good enough to convince officials that the moviola was only dangerous to those who used it, not to anyone else. The excursions in Buenos Aires, or BA as the locals called it, began as they did in Rio, with Ryman and others exploring the city to create sketches and paintings and take photographs. Casual strolling along streets of various sections of the city, wrote Ryman in a journal, noting carts, wagons, flower stalls, architectural details, windows, balusters, cartouche details, bronze gates, mailboxes, dogs, cats, and other heterogeneous objects for use as possible background material. They attended dinners and gatherings. Mainly, we were wined and dined all over the place, said Frank Thomas. It was real hard to do any work. That first week, as Janet Martin recalled, there was an endless line of dinners. All of us began wondering wildly how we could let out the seams in our clothes, for it's an impossibility to get bad food in BA. Once more, Walt tried to spend time with his artists, but again, he was needed for publicity events, not only for presentations designed to engender political goodwill, but also to meet an endless line of fans. In the evenings, he attended multiple premieres for Fantasia, both in Buenos Aires and a nearby city. He spoke to reporters in person and on radio. Late in the day, as he returned home, he often found locals lined up outside the hotel, hoping to shake his hand or to get an autograph. For Ryman, this again conferred how people in countries politically distant from the United States still admired creations produced by Walt's studio and, of course, Walt himself. Walt was not only accepted, Ryman said, the people of Argentina were delighted, and they looked upon us as kind of angels that had landed from another planet, and we were given the very best of care and the very best of treatment, and we were never so entertained in all of our lives. Whereas the artist had easily captured Brazilian culture largely through music, they struggled to pinpoint cultural elements that would effectively represent modern Argentina. Again, they looked to traditional dance. On the rooftop balcony of the hotel, on a brick-floored patio just outside their makeshift studio, local performers demonstrated traditional dances, including the Malambo, a solo foot dance of the Gauchos. One dancer, Miguel Gramajo, recalled Walt's expression while he performed the intricate steps of that dance. Disney got very excited, he said. This caught my attention because he could not understand us and we could not understand him. But I could tell he was very happy. While dancers performed in traditional costume, composer Andreas Chazaretta explained the significance of each dance. Artists created quick sketches in pencil and charcoal, trying to capture the movement and feel of the performance. The visitors dressed Walt in the wool poncho and soft hat of the Gauchos, inviting him more deeply into the culture of their country. Animator Frank Thomas tried a few steps himself, shuffling his leather shoes over the floor, bobbing his head as instructed, and looking out at the whole affair through dark sunglasses with an expression of wonder. Beyond dance, the Disney artist looked to the culture of the Gauchos to provide a possible framework for other cartoons. Gaucho culture, they had already learned, bridged the history of Argentina with its present moment. Gauchos were skilled horsemen, dressed in ponchos, loose-fitting trousers, and soft-brimmed hats. The Disney team visited Gaucho museums, they listened to music about Gauchos, they traveled to ranches to observe men who carried on Gaucho traditions in the flat plains just outside the city. You get out to the Estancia, we'll say around noon, Janet Martin explained. In some nice spot under the trees, you'll see long tables set up. Nearby Gauchos are tending to a fire around which are roasting whole carcasses of calves, lambs, and little pigs. To one side, chickens are roasting, and on a grill in the middle are big sausages sizzling. Several Gauchos slowly turn the meat, which is on big perpendicular spits. The Gauchos rode. They told stories of living on the plains. They demonstrated how to throw the bolas, a loop of rope with weights at the end used, much like the cowboy's lariat, to capture small animals. Once again, Gauchos placed a cloth hat on Walt's head, along with a woven poncho and belt made of circular pieces of metal, like coins stitched together on a string. They asked him to join them on horseback. As Walt was an experienced rider, he obliged. He rode out into the fields. Again, he understood these men were honoring him and claiming him as one of their own. One gaucho even gave him a saddle, a souvenir to take back to the States. By this point, Ryman understood why Walt was repeatedly selected for this role. He had the dark eyebrows and dark eyes and the mustache, Ryman explained, and he looked more like a gaucho than the gauchos did. While the meal cooked, the artist drew the ranch before them, along with images of the men on horseback. They observed how the ponchos shifted over the bodies of the gauchos, the way their soft boots were slightly turned inside of the stirrups, and how sheepskin, draped over their saddles, shifted as horses galloped over the ground. The colors of Argentina, especially in the plains, were different than those of Brazil. The quality of light was different as well. Once again, the Disney artists looked for ways to incorporate the mood of the place into their art. It was a constant effort, not only to differentiate the visual appearance of South America from the United States, but to artistically separate one country from the next, even the plains of Buenos Aires from the city. At the center of this enterprise was Walt. He was able to bring out our hidden energies, Ryman explained. Walt's enthusiasm and curiosity and his affection for all life and for all things were very deep, and he plumbed into the depths of talents around him. Ryman's watercolors picked up new hues and new color combinations, a vibrancy of paints that was different than those just 3 years earlier he had used to capture the coast of Maine. The drawings of artists reflected the vigor and melodies of local music, images that often appeared more energetic than those they had worked on back home. But no one's art was more deeply transformed by the South American experience than that of Mary Blair. Though Lee and Mary Blair had both worked at the studio as concept artists, fellow Disney employees, at least before this trip, tended to think of Lee as the more gifted painter. But prompted by the sights and sounds around her, Mary's work evolved. Years ago, she had arranged watercolors so they fit the mode of artful illustration typically favored by large circulation magazines, such as McCall's and Good Housekeeping, a style she had been working to modify for years. In ways, her painting style was similar to that of her husband, watercolors with muted tones that leaned toward realism. But removed from her home in California, she was prompted to rethink her practices and how she related to her subjects. She was spurred toward invention, inspired not only by the land, but by the other artists around her, some of the best employed at the Disney studio. Her watercolors, growing in complexity and power, presented figures assembled from a series of identifiable shapes, something like collage. Her paintings now were often composed with a dark background, out of which intense colors rose up to form the image. Her work experimented with aspects of folk art, paired with touches of surrealism and even elements of the graphic arts. It was a style of painting with its roots in multiple traditions that was becoming uniquely hers. Frank Thomas explained, Mary Blair, was just breaking into her own style and doing marvelous things. She was great. Ryman, too, noticed a new authority in her work, color groupings that were not only related to the land around them, but that spoke to something larger, such as the way a child might picture the world, or a dream people wanted to inhabit even after they woke at dawn. Just as Ryman's trip to Europe and then Asia had transformed his work, Mary was finding a new level of originality in her work while she was in South America. For Ryman, there was another lesson in all of this. Years ago, he had traveled to foreign countries to continue his education at his own expense. But here, in Argentina, Mary Blair deepened her art at the studio's expense. In this, Ryman understood one of the key differences between MGM and Disney. MGM was interested in art in as much as it benefited its films. Walt, too, was interested in the progress of animation. But beyond that, he had created a studio that, when possible, helped employees develop their own vision as well. For days, the Disney team absorbed the atmosphere. They expressed it with pencils, charcoals, and brushes. They sampled food and drink. They listened to music. They returned to the plains to see more gauchos. They felt the importance of their work, understanding that it encouraged an ongoing unity between North, Central, and South America. Now that they'd been here many weeks, in the evenings, they explored their travel options after Argentina. Walt is now talking about going back to New York by boat from Chile, Frank Thomas recalled, and sending us out in all directions to get back the best we can. They found it exciting to consider what other countries might be explored before they returned home. But back in California, important stories were playing out there as well. By the start of September, Roy Disney was working with a government agency to resolve the strike. A federal conciliation service required that the studio, once fully reopened, rehire both striking and non-striking employees. To ensure fairness, they defined target percentages for each department so that work was spread evenly between pro and anti-union factions. Once this agreement was in place, the studio could return to normal business, inasmuch as normal business could be engaged in the current global economy. A fully reopened studio also meant that there was now no practical reason to keep a branch operation open in Buenos Aires after Walt left. The story of the strike, it seemed, would likely be over before the Disney team arrived home, an ending that almost surely would contain a new set of problems. But there was another story unfolding in California that would more deeply affect Walt. During these same months, Walt's father, Elias, fell ill. For the past 3 years after the death of his wife, Elias had lived on his own in relatively stable health. The most serious conditions concerned his memory. At times he forgot that his wife, Flora, had died. When Walt left for Brazil, Elias had been in reasonable health, even if he appeared somewhat lost at times. A month and a half after Walt's departure, he experienced stomach pains followed by vomiting. Early in September, he was taken by ambulance to Hollywood Hospital, where doctors operated to relieve a bowel blockage, a risky procedure for a man 82 years old. He woke from the surgery, but by that point, he had acquired a secondary infection, an illness that had settled into his lungs with symptoms that resembled pneumonia. From there, he developed a fever that quickly rose to 105. Within a day, he was gone. Though Roy had previously told Walt about their father's illness, he had believed that their father would recover and hadn't understood how quickly his condition might deteriorate. On September 13th, Roy sent his brother a telegram to explain that their father had passed. Walt would later explain how he received the news. "He died unexpectedly," Walt said. "I was in South America when he died, 1941. As with other tragedies, Walt chose to experience his emotions privately. He didn't discuss the matter in detail with his artists, but they sensed how deeply the news affected him. Local reporters also knew about his loss, some of whom expressed their condolences to him individually. All his life, Walt had feared death. In his first 2 features, Snow White and Pinocchio, the title characters in the story's final moments returned from the dead to find happiness. But there would be nothing like that for Elias. Artist Norm Ferguson wrote a letter to Roy to explain that, in his estimation, Walt was taking the loss reasonably well. "We knew just about how he felt on getting the news," he said. He also indicated that all of the Disney artists were there to support him. Though Walt had been close to his father during those final years, he chose to remain in Argentina as he was buried. He didn't discuss his reasons, but a likely explanation concerns the many days it would take to travel from Buenos Aires to California, also how the Goodwill Project might lose focus without him. Unsure how to express their sympathy, the Disney artists sent lilies arranged into a 3.5-foot cross to the chapel. By this point, A new familiarity moved between Walt and Ryman, almost surely related in some way to the death of Walt's father. They talked with each other. They seemed to understand each other's ambitions. They both had been born into relative poverty and had spent their childhoods in the Midwest. Ryman had lost his father over 2 decades ago, though the effects of that loss stayed with him. Walt preferred to direct conversations away from emotional issues that weighed down his current thoughts, including those focused on his father, but he did talk about other struggles. One morning, shortly after 8 a.m., Walt came to Herbie's room and knocked. I opened the door, Ryman explained, and there was Walt with a suit on and a shirt and a tie. He stood there for a moment, then asked, Can I come in? Well, of course, Ryman said. Ryman's room was large, with high ceilings and curtained windows that opened to the park many stories below. Walt took a seat on the edge of the bed. He appeared tired, having spent weeks with government officials and the public representing both the studio and the American way of life. I'm getting sick and tired of being a goddamn gaucho where I go, he said. He explained that he was frustrated with how the Goodwill events ended up removing him from the group. Walt would either be taken as the guest of honor to a room with dignitaries, or he would travel with his wife and a couple of artists to an event such as a film premiere, while the rest of the artists explored the country. Damn it, we're all here together, he said. We came down here together, and I don't know why we should be separated. Because you're dancing with the president's wife, and we're at another table, Ryman answered. Why can't we be a family? Walt said. Can't we have a picnic? I want us to have a picnic. Ryman understood that Walt was, in his own way, reaching out to him, expressing that his artists were the people that he had chosen to travel with him. They had been picked, it was now clear, not only for their abilities, but because Walt enjoyed their company. This showed me he wasn't content to just be the guest of honor, Ryman later explained. He wanted to be with his people, and he chose those people himself. Walt sat there in this hotel room 6,000 miles away from the Burbank studio and talked for a while more. As he did, Ryman realized that there was something different now between them, something that felt inevitable. You can't live in Rio in Argentina for 3 months with a man and his wife without getting to know him, Ryman explained. They weren't friends in a formal sense, but they were moving in that direction, a relationship that was difficult to define but held a unique meaning, especially as Walt had looked to Ryman for company a few days after his father's death. The Disney team would soon leave Buenos Aires to explore other countries in South America, but Ryman would carry this moment with him, this conversation he shared with Walt. It would be one of the stories he would tell for years, as this conversation initiated a new closeness between the two men. A relationship that would play out in interesting ways long after they returned home. I'll be back next week with a new episode. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available anywhere else. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.